Jan and Jochen, thank you both so very, very much. And we'll hear more about this project later in the day. We'll be back. The idea of forensic memory brings us to our next speaker, who also investigates forensic memory, Eyal Weizman. Eyal Weizman is an architect, a professor of spatial visual cultures, and also the director of the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths in London. Since 2011, he also directs the European Research Council funded project Forensic Architecture on the place of architecture in international humanitarian law. His many books include Mengeles Skull, that's a recent publication he co-authored with Thomas Keenan, Forensic Architecture, talking about the forensic memory for Documenta 13, and also The Least of All Possible Evils in 2011. In 2010, Eyal had a very memorable conversation with Richard Hamilton, whom we'd like to remember here, about a map Richard had developed for the exhibition at the Serpentine, a map of Palestine. A very, very warm welcome to Eyal Weizman.
Okay, while they set it up, I'd just like to say how pleased I am to speak here in a marathon that comes to really almost an always premature death of Erich Hobsbawm. And I'm somehow going to heed to his advice that I heard from Hans-Ulrich he has given to connect the concept of memory and that of war. And I think that today we can understand war very much through the analysis that is offered by human rights organizations. So I'm going to speak a little bit about human rights methodologies, or a shift in human rights methodologies in relation to memory. And to say that, in fact, recently, and when I say recently, in the last decade and a half, a certain methodological shift could be observed. And that is a shift from human to material memory within the discourse of human rights and international humanitarian law. So from DNA to satellite images of large territories, human rights are now most often investigated by the cross-interrogation of non-human witnesses, interpreted through science. So it's a kind of a, if you think about it, human rights, for human rights, testimony and memory is always more or in excess of the epistemic question of what took place, what happened. For human rights, testimony and memory are a kind of a value in itself. It's a certain, it's part and parcel of what they are in a sense of a kind of the ethical position of taking the individual voice against the arbitrariness of a state, or and therefore very much connected to the sort of anti-totalitarian foundations of human rights discourse. And what I'm going to think about together with you today is what happened when material memory or evidence, material evidence, comes not only to corroborate human testimony or human memory, but somehow to replace or supersede it. Indeed, the primacy according to human testimony and to the subjective and linguistic dimension of memory is gradually being supplemented, or actually bypassed, by an object-oriented juridical culture. immersed in matter and materialities, in a presentation of scientific investigation by expert. Tom Keenan and I, in the book that Hans-Ulrich mentioned, called that the new forensic aesthetics. And look at this sequence of 3 images. I think that the image that Marco Alasco, the human rights investigator that has taken it, is a classic human rights photograph. Do you see it at all, or is that too bright here? It's a woman standing admirably steadfast in front of the ruins of her own home. A human rights investigator would take that photograph. But everything that is interesting about that image is actually, for this person, is actually in the background. He interprets in a trash and rubble that of the remains of what has been her home, the kind of the story that needs to be told, to the extent that he actually stands in front of her within this slide. When literary critics Shoshana Feldman and psychoanalyst Dori Laub referred to the last century of the 20th, to the last decades of the 20th century as the era of testimony, they referred to the time around the end of the last century when the written, recorded, filmed, and exhibit testimony of the memory of calamities and catastrophes, and they were talking mainly of the Holocaust, structure our understanding of the problem of the present. We also heard Jay Winter yesterday speaking about a similar kind of process in which memory becomes something of the hinge around which the kind of the postmodern era turns, right? I mean, testimony and memory is in its sort of epistemological value, is somehow opening up history into multiple voices, oral histories, the stories of victims, etc. Through the emerging field of memory studies, testimony has become this hinge that I was speaking about. Engagement with memory has left its mark in literature, documentary, and the visual arts. Politically, testimony acquired a visible presence in Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in human rights and humanitarian work. But what is the problem in kind of seeing our histories of war or political processes simply from the point of view of the victim? Something in that has also kind of close to the risk of depoliticizing events. We are replacing understanding of collective action, of agency, with compassion, and political action with a kind of sort of tuning to what is just very human in those testimonies. If testimony and memory had an ethical, political, and aesthetic dimension, which I just briefly mentioned, what happened to these in a shift to materiality? I think that forensic truth is not simply a product of positivism, the desire to overcome language through materiality and hold reality knowable without any intermediary, but the making of facts through narrative presentations. If memory is the process by which information is encoded, stored, and retrieved, and also the shifts and distortion that happen within and between those different stages, I think one of the main kind of assumption of memory studies is it is exactly if testimony is trauma filtered, or memory is filtered through trauma into testimony, it is actually in the slippages and the mistakes of the somehow inaccuracies that are derived by the presentation, in the presentation of testimony, that the truth of violence occurs, right, or could be identified. I think similar things could be also observed in the kind of the whole discussion of the material memory. Every contact leaves a trace, and thus every object, may there be bones, walls, earth, trees, territories, or Madeleine cookies, for that matter, register their environment. Matter is responsive to the environment and continuously registers it through the duration of time. In this sense, potentially, all things are senses, all matters are senses, if we know how to read them. But they are also weak senses. They distort what they what is imprinted in them. They're not, I mean, you know, if you say a strong sensor is something like quicksilver, no? I mean, if it expands, it registers temperature. Objects are censored in a weak sense. They continuously intervene, matter intervene in the process that is imprinted on it. This image that I show you now is one of the hinges in that transformation from human testimony to material memory that is at the center of my presentation today. The person here on the image is Clyde Snow. The trial is the trial of the Argentine junta in the middle of the 80s. And Clyde Snow, perhaps one of the great grave-diggers of the 20th century, is presenting a skull. This is a skull of a woman called Liliana Priera. He presents it, Snow presents bones in a strange way. For Snow, bones are never evidence. They're never objects. They're subjects. Snow say, bones make great witnesses. They whisper softly, but they never forget and they never lie. Now, of course, he would say they never forget and they never lie because he's an expert witness and that's his position in court. But in a sense here, what is happening is a certain blurring between subjects and objects. And I think that bones are special in that. They are the kind of objects from which the trace of the subject is never fully erased. They haunt it. They remain with it. Snow and other gravediggers mark a shift in emphasis in human rights investigation from the living to the dead, from presence to representation, from human memory to material memory. But the problem of the witness that I mentioned before, contradiction, memory loss, blackouts, those things that register trauma, are not simply overcome by its replacement with the object and with science. The presentation of the object involves, of course, an arduous construction conducted with the aid of scientific protocol, rhetorics, and theatrics, with professional and ethical credibility necessary to construct and demolish facts in the world. And this is what we call or refer to as the forensic aesthetics. It's in the interpretation of the objects, some of the problem associated with the human witness are actually reproduced. This is the book that Hans-Ulrich has actually mentioned. And a certain particular investigation that happened in Brazil in the middle of the 1980s, the exhumation and attempt for identification of the bones of the Nazi war criminal Joseph Mengele, provided somehow the science that allowed later a lot of other exhumation to take place in the context of human rights and war crime investigation. Here, the Brazilian head of police, going to a small suburb of Sao Paulo, is holding the skull, suspected to be that of Mengele, and presenting or stating that the search has ended, Mengele has been discovered. But in fact, doubt started emerging. And what has happened, we describe in the book, as a certain trial of the bone. A trial that is not undertaken by lawyers and by judges, but by scientists, according to kind of peer review process by which scientists check each other's finding. And within that process, the most important methodology that was somehow named is that of Osteo Biography. Osteo Biography in itself kind of testifies for the certain blurring between subject and object, a biography of the object itself, the biography of the bone. And the bone for them is a certain, like a film, that is exposed to life like a negative is exposed to light, in a kind of a slow exposure process by which labor conditions, nutrition, migration, if you migrate from a more humid to a less humid place, of course, your medical history are registered. But they are registered not on a static object, but in an object that is a kind of a life substance that continuously grows and contracts. So in a sense, when you think about this memory storage capacity of objects are always in transformation. Objects are always recording and erasing the kind of the history in which they are existing. Every object exists in the world and continuously registers the world around it, like a monad, right? It continuously registers its environment. But the substance of its materiality always is under transformation. So that issue of Osteo Biography is somehow important for me as an architect, as I will show you later, because I'm in kind of my architectural methodologies of forensic architecture, I'm trying to read political forces from architectural form, and architectural form itself being under continuous transformation. No building is ever static. Buildings are continuously responsive to the environment. They continue to transform in relation to what happens around them. This is a short sequence simply of the technique of teasing that history out of the bone, a technology of projecting an image of life, an image of the person on the bones themselves, a certain subject over object, death over life, that testifies for the kind of the blurring between object and subject that shift to the forensic aesthetic actually embodies. And kind of this hilarious image of Mengele's skulls wearing a hat in this photograph. So bones and ruins make a good analogy, as I've mentioned before. Because in my work I have seen, and I've called architecture the political plastic. Architecture is a political plastic in as much as it registers political forces in form. This is an abstraction, a bit of a map that I've done of Jewish settlement in the West Bank. I've actually erased all scale and location markings on it to simply kind of make the point that we can look at formal organization and start teasing from the very minute details within form the forces and processes that created it. In fact, we should be able to press play on that image, and we would see how politics, as it develops, continuously translates into formal organization. If material reality is a mediation of forces into form, then we might be able, under certain conditions, to see matter as a memory of political forces. So, in a certain sense, methodologically, in writing architectural history, I think that it is somehow those scientists, engineers, structural engineers that could interpret the destroyed buildings, etc., in relation to the processes and forces that made them, that could be the people to write history today. These images are of what is called the Pyramids of Gaza. The Pyramids of Gaza, as opposed to the Pyramids of Giza, emerge out of a collision between two things that are very known and current to the Gaza Strip. A D9 Caterpillar bulldozer and a 3-story residential building typical of homes of refugees. As the bulldozer circles the building, its short shovel can only topple the peripheral column of a building. The central column remains intact, and the beam cracks around the crest now of the pyramid, folding on both sides to make the shape of the pyramid itself. The pyramids of Gaza are not as ideal in form like the pyramids of Giza, and in fact, it is the differentiation between one in the patterns of those pyramids that we see more and more in Palestinian cities and refugee camps, that the investigation, a forensic investigation, or forensic architectural investigation must begin. These emerge out of an archive compiled by the Hamas government of Gaza, an enormous book of destruction that they have put together of every building that was destroyed during Israel attack on the Gaza Strip. We're talking about 15 to 20,000 buildings either damaged or destroyed. In that book of destruction, they are all photographed. There is a catalog number. Sometimes the photographer would hold the catalog number in front of his own camera or her own camera, as the photograph is taken. And every building in Gaza, either destroyed or built, has this sort of catalog number either etched on the building, tattooed on the building, or on that, in either in kind of quantifying the destruction, or in expectation of it. Every building, even that is not destroyed in Gaza Strip, has this catalog number on it. So this enormous book of destruction. But also cracks are interesting in buildings. Cracks always demonstrate somehow, they are kind of the line of least resistance that travel through a building as contradictory in forces are applied on its materiality. But cracks are interesting because they do not understand the difference between a building and the street, or the building and the city, or between geology and architecture. They move from rock formation, from archaeology, into buildings, appearing and disappearing, translating force contradiction into the line of least resistance as they travel through it. And I think somehow in that understanding that a crack is always a political diagram, we can always learn something of what is happening in a subterranean. These cracks in Silwan are the result of illegal excavation, archaeological excavation done by Jewish organization under a Palestinian neighborhood in Jerusalem. The cracks move from archaeology into the rock, from the rock into the building, from the building into the street, etc. In our process of undertaking forensic archaeology, we are also working through the rainforest in Guatemala, trying almost to read the braille of the terrain by locating the foundation stones of some of 400 villages destroyed in Guatemala by the military junta during the 1980s. Sometimes the entire building itself, built of organic material, would completely disintegrate. The rainforest, of course, accelerates the process of disintegration. What remains is really minute differentiation in the surface that are spotted by it. Part of forensic architecture and the kind of reading of it is now becoming popularized through this form of before and after images that we see now very often in newspapers and in the internet, continuously kind of translating or showing to us political events as architectural transformation. In fact, in before and after photographs taken by satellite images, it is always the orbit of the satellite that sequences the capacity to take those images. The act itself is always missing. There's always a lacuna at the heart of the event, or the historical event is replaced by the architectural event. We understand or can speculate about ethnic cleansing or genocide in Darfur based on counting destroyed huts there, or on what's happening in nuclear facilities or other missile facilities in Iran, based on a certain archaeology. But it's not an archaeology of matter itself. It's an archaeology of wavelengths, an archaeology of pixels, an archaeology of photograph, by which a kind of what Gilles Deleuze called the archaeology of the present is kind of undertaken through that interpretation of photography. But that interpretation, that reading of satellite images is not always happening through the human eye, but it is images that produce for machines. These are images that are produced by wavelengths that are beyond the visible spectrum, by heat waves and otherwise, and patterns, the pattern that they generate, and this is images of deforestation during the 1982 destruction of Ixchil Maya that I showed you before in Guatemala, of understanding of natural transformation, transformation of vegetation that testify for these political processes. So we're having now human rights not only kind of arbitrated on kind of non-human evidence, but the thing that reads those images are themselves algorithms and computers. So we have a kind of a twice removed relation to that. Do you need me to wrap up? Okay. I mean, I could, in fact, leave now. Only to say that in the replacement of the human witness with the material witness, here I think a very good demonstration of that. This is the Goldstone, Justice Goldstone, presenting his finding of the Gaza attack. He's actually standing in front of the ruin. It's almost as if there is a press conference where the ruin is asked to speak. There are those microphones put in front of that building. Because the building could not speak, Goldstone speak on its behalf. But if you look at the methodology section of this very famous report, you would see that shift from testimony to evidence is very clearly articulated within it. Rather than taking only human evidence or having his report based on interview with Palestinians, Goldstone assumes that the voice of Palestinians would not be believed in that report. This would always be contested as being manipulated by Hamas. Therefore, the report shifts from human testimony to pathological evidence and building evidence. And I think that here you can see where those types of material and human memory are actually not in kind of corroborative relation, but when one actually starts hiding the other. And I think that is something that we must be tuned to when we sort of understand and look and perhaps some places appreciate this type of evidence as it is presented of war today. Thank you very much.